From earliest times, care of the aged has been an integral part of the church's ministry. In the letter to Timothy, for example, the early churches asked to treat older men as they would their fathers and older women as they would their mothers. And for those in authority to treat older people in authority with double honour. What a nice message. And certainly, I think, an important message for today's society, in which I don't think ageing is very much valued. When you look at, for example, the television ads, they're nearly all about age-defying products, how to keep yourself young, how to make sure you don't look your age, you don't act your age. For older people, what message is that giving? Surely it's giving the message that you're not valued. Therefore, for the church, it seems to me it's the focus for a vital ministry. The pastoral dimension of care is central to care of the ageing. In the CHA booklet on being pastoral, it defines pastoral as being relational, present and authentic. Now, if ever there's a place that you need to be that, it's aged care. I think it's really vital that staff recognise that these are not clients in their workplace, but rather they're workers in the resident's home. And that visitors and residents' relatives are visitors in the resident's home. And I think that's really important that they're treated that way. A special sensitivity and patience and gentleness is needed in aged care. It's really about creating the arena for people's stories of life and love and loss and meaning. And those opportunities abound, not just for pastoral workers, but for anybody who's working in aged care. From showering the resident to helping them with their meals or to tidying up their room. There are plenty of opportunities to create that space. And I think that's vital, and that means that gives emphasis to the fact that everyone needs to be pastoral. The aged person's often very conscious that the workers are doing things for them, like showering and caring for them. And some of them can feel like they're a burden, or they can feel put upon that people are looking after them. And often you can reframe that with people, I think, and I'll often say to people, I bet you've spent all your life doing that for everybody else, haven't you? And that will elicit from people a long story of how that's true. I don't think I've yet had anybody who's denied that. So they'll give you the story of how they've cared for many children or people that they've cared for throughout their lives, and that's a great opportunity for me to say, well then, don't you think it's about time somebody looked after you? It's your turn. Think of yourself like the Queen. She gets every washing done for her. Why shouldn't you? And usually that gets a laugh, and it's got some truth in it too. There's a great song that we sing at Mass sometimes. It says, will you let me be your servant? And then it says, and let me be your servant too. And I think it's harder to let somebody else serve ourselves sometimes. And that's a good thing to work with the residents, I think, on actually letting people serve them. The essentially communal nature of aged care poses some challenges for the formal pastoral care within the facility, I think. The models of pastoral care for acute care are different to what you need in aged care. In aged care, one needs to recognise that it's about facilitating relationships and community. And those relationships exist between the pastoral carer and the resident, clearly, in individual visitation. But the pastoral arena is much wider, and the pastoral care worker's role is really to facilitate pastoral relationships between staff and resident, between residents and residents, and sometimes between residents and families. Look, just as there's no one-size-fits-all approach to the rest of our lives, that's true for aged care too, and true for spirituality in aged care. That's why assessment is a really important part of the pastoral worker's role. We need to get to know the individual in that community, and what are the things that give them meaning? What are the things that nourish their spirit? That's a very important role of the pastoral worker in aged care. That then might lead them to discover things about the resident that they wouldn't have assumed. You can't assume, for example, that just because someone's Catholic, putting on a Mass once a week is sufficient nourishing of someone's spirit. It's not. Similarly, that they might like to join a rosary group. Well, they might, but they might not. So I think it's really important, once one gets to know the people with whom one's working, to offer a variety of things. Some of these people will come from backgrounds, denominations or parishes where there have been Bible groups, for example, or hymn singing groups, or justice groups, or Lenten groups, or Advent groups. I think that recognition that group and connectivity, back to that relationship, is vital, is a really good skill for a pastoral worker in aged care. So there needs to be, sure, one-on-one visitation at times when that's needed, and certainly they'll like that. But a much more important skill, I think, is being able to make people feel like they are individually being nourished and cared for within a group setting. And I see that happen often in aged care. In aged care, a lot of the pastoral care situations will happen outside when the pastoral care person is there, and they're informal. And I think it's important for the pastoral care person or the staff to leave resources that are available for people to draw upon in those times. It might just be simply some nice magazines or reflective books, or a Bible in large print left somewhere that people could access. It might be lovely music softly playing in a chapel. It might not be a chapel, it might just be a nicely decorated reflective space, lovely gardens, meditative places. Just leaving resources for people that they can utilise as suits them, I think is also a really good pastoral gift to give people. No one likes to think that they're doing all the taking and someone else is giving all the giving. And I think another really important pastoral skill is to convey to people what it is they're actually giving. To be genuine in that, not to make it up like a platitude, but when you actually see that in action, to express it. I can think of a time with a lady who was well into her 90s, and I remember saying to her, you know, you really model for me ageing in a beautiful way. And she was quite bemused by that and made me tell her how. And I said, well, you know, you seem to enjoy others' company but not be hungry for it. You show me a way of being serene in old age, really. I see you sitting quietly in the garden. I see you reading reflectively, and you just have a serenity about you that, for me, says that's a great place to be in your age. And I look at you and think, gee, I hope I can be like that. She took it and took it as a compliment, but at the same time laughed and said, oh yes, well, I don't know what to do about that because I'm constantly saying to God, I don't want to be the oldest person in your waiting room. And we had a bit of a laugh. But I think to tell her that just being the oldest person in the waiting room doesn't mean it's a waste of space. It was a gift to me, and I meant it, and it is, and I do hope I age like her. The Catholic Church does death and dying pretty well, I think, and people often say that. They'll often say, gee, you know, you Catholics treat funerals and do death and dying pretty well, and I think we do. And I think as a Catholic facility, we need to model that too. You don't hear the prayers for those who've passed on in our liturgy. You don't hear the prayers for those who are lost. You hear the commendation of the dying, prayers for the dead. And similarly in a Catholic facility, we need to be comfortable with naming the fact that death and dying are part of life and a part of an aged care facility. And that's with residents too. Residents will often welcome somebody who isn't too afraid to talk about death or dying. Something that sometimes amuses me is when staff will come to you quite worried and say, you know, Mabel's talking about dying and you might need to see her. And I say, oh yeah, well, Mabel is 95 and talking about dying is probably a really good thing for Mabel to be talking about. And it is. And I think we can create the space where people can talk about their fears or their hopes or their relief or what it is that they want to talk about as they think about their dying. And with relatives too, they can welcome that somebody will actually tell them it as it is and talk with them about what are their concerns. That applies to acknowledgement of death in a facility too. I think in this time of where we're all concerned about privacy regulations and all those sorts of things, we can sometimes get lost in rules and not think about the spirit. It's really important for residents, for example, to know what's gone on with their fellow residents. It's not fair enough in a Catholic organisation to say, well, we don't tell the other residents that someone's died. I mean, they may be sitting at the same table with someone, and then the next time they go to the table, there's no one there. Well, if you're saying it's their home, I can't think of a home where someone just disappears. You deal with it and you talk with it. And you do it with sensitivity, but you name it as it is. And that's really important. I think it's also important because it's about respect. And it shows the living residents how their life's valued. And they will look and think, well, gee, you know, people are acknowledging that Mary had a very vital contribution to make to this home. And there's her picture with the candle flickering next to her. Or we're having a toast tour at the happy hour. Or we're talking about what was nice about Mary. Or we've got a book sitting in the foyer where people are allowed to write messages about Mary when Mary's died. I think those sort of things, however you do them, doesn't matter how you do them, but that you do them is very important, I think. Dr. Elizabeth McKinlay, the Director of the Centre of Ageing and Pastoral Studies in Canberra, proposes the idea of a midwife for dying. And that's a great image for pastoral care, I think. Pastoral care could well step up and be the midwife for people in that stage. The person who journeys with, is alongside, is there when they're needed, is not there when they're not needed. Understands that the process is the person's, the process of dying, but that the person may need some resources along the way and may call on them. I think that's where pastoral assessment, if it's been done well as they've got to know the resident, is really important. That's when you can draw upon, I know that this person really loved classical music, so classical music might be nice in the room as they're lying there. I know this person said often, I'd like the rosary said when I was dying. Or I know this person said, I don't want people sitting by the bed saying the rosary when I'm dying. Again, this knowledge that pastoral care has of the residents, and other staff have, can be really well utilised at that time to help the person on their journey. Of course, death is not the only place where grief comes into play in aged care. It's actually a frequent visitor. When people come into aged care, many of them carry grief. If you think about what they've left behind their house, perhaps the house where they brought up all their children and all their memories have been contained. They're leaving behind neighbours. And sometimes they're neighbours who won't get into the facility to visit them because they too are older and incapacitated. They're leaving their favourite haunts, the local library, the coffee shop, the lady in the chemist shop they talk to. All those things are being left behind. Pets. Many people, their constant companion's been their pet. So I think attending to the griefs and recognising the griefs that people have is really important for all staff, including the pastoral care, and also recognising that has an effect on relatives too. So that sometimes if we experience people not wanting to join in or people being angry or critical, sometimes if we can take a step back and say, what's happening for this person, we can get another perspective on what's happening for them. And what's happening is often grief that we need to work with. Another area of loss is that of dementia and related illnesses. And I saw an article, I read it once, called God is Not Absent in Dementia. Great article and great line that pastoral carers who've worked with people with dementia know very well. Sometimes, if you're looking for the poorest of the poor, you might find it there, in that area of the residential aged care facility. That might be the area where people spend less time. Therefore, it needs to be the area where pastoral carers spend more time. With people with dementia, just because they've lost some of their memories and faculties, it's time for us to work on what they haven't lost. And pastoral care is well in the place to do that, because many of the things that people don't lose are around symbol and music and art, the very things that feed the soul. I can think of numerous times such as taking someone who had really no conversational skills left to Mass and sitting her in the front seat. And she answered the whole Mass, including saying the priest parts, word perfect I might add. Or another one who in the Our Father, when we got to the words that said, forgive us our sins as we forgive others, called out, yes, we need to do that. And another one that was very agitated when we took her into a service of anointing, and we were wondering whether she should be there or not be there, and she was clutching my hand and saying, "Don't leave me, don't leave me." And then the minister came around to anoint people, and I just held her hands out and said, "Father's going to just anoint your hands." And she held them out, and he anointed her hands, and I felt, as I was holding her arm, her hands go very, very, very serene. And instead of clasping mine like she'd been doing, she joined her own hands. And while I kept close to her so that my shoulder was touching hers and she knew I was still nearby, she didn't need me anymore. She was now connected with her sense of the transcendent. She couldn't have explained that in words, probably, definitely actually, but at that moment she was connected with her God. And I think that's what pastoral people really need to look for, is where can the connections to meaning be made for those people, and provide opportunities for that. And also not to assume that every time's going to be the same. I might have taken that person the next week and there'd have been no chance of her staying or being involved in the ceremony. Similarly, you'll take a person and they might receive the Eucharist one week and not be able the next. It's very important with a dementia person to treat every time as a new time. They may like reminiscence, they might like to retell the stories. You might be able to bring something. I can think of an example of a pastoral care worker who was just moving into the area with dementia care, and it was Lent. So she thought she'd take some purple material down to the people and have a little Lenten group. So the purple material she took down, being the Catholic symbol of, purple for Lent, thought that'd be really good. Well, one danced with it, one swathed it around like my scarf, and she came back and she said, "Well, we had a fun time, but it absolutely was useless." The next week, she took just a simple cross. And I remember a beautiful picture that someone took of one of the residents just picking the cross, holding the cross, really being touched by the cross. And many people touched the cross, finding a symbol that speaks. Might be a flower, might be a picture. But I think that's the role of pastoral care too, to recognise certainly God isn't absent in dementia, and there's meaning that we can touch with people with dementia. Catholic health and aged care is about the healing ministry of Jesus. And care of the ageing is a place where one can really strongly feel that you are participating in that to the full and being part of that healing ministry.